The note was on the kitchen counter. Not pushed to the edge, not tucked under anything, just there, in the center, on a square of paper that had been torn from something larger. The kitchen light was on because I always left it on when I came back after dark, and the light was very bright, and the note was very small, and I stood there for what felt like a long time, reading it. It said, "Hope the call with your mom went okay." That was all. No signature, but I knew the handwriting from the lease. The same slightly cramped lowercase, the same way the G's closed into themselves. Martin's handwriting. The call with my mom. My mother has been dead for 3 years. I have not told a single person in this city that fact. Not a coworker on a video call, not the woman at the coffee shop who had started remembering my order. Not anyone. I had not told Martin. I had not told anyone. I stood there holding the note with both hands like it was something fragile, and I was not breathing. Or I was breathing but not in any way I could feel, and the kitchen was very quiet except for the forced air heat coming on somewhere in the walls and making that low metallic sound it always made, that resonance that moved through everything. My mother has been dead for 3 years. He wrote, "Hope the call with your mom went okay." I need to go back. I need to explain how I got here because none of it made any sense until it all did at once. And the way it happened, the specific order things fell into place, that matters. The order is the whole story. So, 6 weeks earlier, the city I moved from was 300 miles west, and I am not going to name it. I'd been there for 6 years, long enough to learn the street grid without thinking, long enough to have a dry cleaner who knew my name, long enough to have built a whole life around a person I was no longer with. 4 years. His name doesn't matter either. What matters is that I ended it in late August, and by mid-September, I understood that staying in that city while we had the same friends and the same coffee shop and the same weekend farmers market was going to cost me something I couldn't afford to spend. So I left. Took the job I'd been quietly negotiating for 3 months. Fully remote, data analytics for a logistics company, the kind of work that travels anywhere there's a reliable internet connection. Looked at apartments in 4 cities. This one came up. Upper floor of a 2-flat, 1-bedroom, big windows, $900 a month, available October 1st. The rent was the thing. The rent made everything else negotiable. I took a long weekend in late September to fly out and see it. Martin met me on the front steps, a man in his early 60s, gray at the temples, holding a ring of keys and wearing a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times it had gone soft at the collar. He showed me the apartment. He showed me the laundry in the basement. He told me about the heat, which was forced air from a system installed in the 90s. And he said it was reliable but loud, and that the ductwork was original to the house and I might hear some sound movement, especially between floors. He said this matter-of-factly, the way you warn someone about a thing you've warned people about many times. The apartment itself was exactly the kind of place that has been lived in hard for a long time. The floors were real wood, but scuffed and uneven in the hall. The kitchen had been renovated at some point in the 90s. Cream tile, one cabinet whose door didn't hang quite flush, a window over the sink that looked out onto a narrow gangway between buildings. The bathroom door was warped at the frame, wouldn't latch properly, drifted open 2 or 3 inches if you didn't hold it. Martin mentioned he'd been meaning to fix that. I said it was fine. There was a smell, old radiator paint and something underneath it. Mineral, faintly chemical. The smell of a space that has been opened and closed many times over many decades. I noticed it on the walkthrough and stopped noticing it by the end of the first week. That happens with smells. You absorb them and they disappear. The building was built in 1947. Martin had lived in the lower unit for 19 years. He said this on the walkthrough, and I remember thinking, 19 years. That is a person who knows every sound this building makes. I signed the lease. I paid first and last. What that left in my savings? $412. The math after that was very simple. Breaking the lease costs 2 months' rent, which is $1,800. I did not have $1,800. I would not have $1,800 for a while. I moved in on October 1st, and I knew, clearly, without needing to write it down, that I was staying for at least the year. The other calculation, the one I didn't do on paper but did anyway, was about what it would mean to go back. I had left loudly, told everyone I needed a clean start, needed a city that wasn't his city, needed to stop running into my own old life at every corner. Everyone had watched me go. Some people had expressed admiration, which is the most pressure any decision can be placed under. Going back 6 weeks later, admitting I'd been wrong, admitting the apartment was a mistake, admitting I was scared of my own landlord for reasons I couldn't fully explain yet. That was a cost I'd already run the numbers on. It was too high. I needed this to work. I needed to not have been wrong. So that was where I was. That was the math. The first 3 weeks were actually fine. I mean that. I got into a routine with the speed that only happens when you're new to a place and a little bit desperate to feel normal. Coffee shop 3 blocks east, corner table, 7:30 on weekday mornings before the workday started. Laptop open, earbuds in. The Wi-Fi there was reliable, and I learned pretty fast that if I got there before 8, the place smelled like bread from the bakery next door, and after 8, it smelled like 50 people's coffee, and I had a preference. The grocery store was 4 blocks the other direction. I found the bus that went downtown. I learned the garbage pickup was Thursdays. I talked to my sister every few days. I talked to my 2 close friends, Devora in the city I'd left, Priya, who had been in Boston for the last year, less often but regularly. These were the people who knew everything, and I did not want to import all of it into whatever I was trying to build here. So the conversations were warm and present and not very deep. That was intentional. That was me trying. The work was good. Data analytics is a job I find genuinely absorbing in a way that feels almost embarrassing to admit. I like finding the thing that doesn't fit the expected distribution. I like the moment a pattern becomes visible. My job is basically asking large numbers of data points whether they have a secret, which sounds ridiculous when I say it that way, but is more or less what it is. I was good at it before the move. I stayed good at it. That continuity helped. I was starting, slowly, to feel like a person who lived here, rather than a person who had temporarily installed herself somewhere unfamiliar. And then, on day 8, Martin knocked. It was a Tuesday evening, around 6. He had a small tool, a flathead screwdriver, in one hand, and a slightly preoccupied look, the way someone looks when they're in the middle of a task and have briefly stepped away from it. He said he wanted to check in, make sure the heat had been running consistently. He said there was sometimes an airflow issue in the upper unit when the temperature dropped below freezing. I said the heat had been fine. He nodded and wrote something in a small notebook. He always had this notebook, I would notice later. Small and brown, in the left front pocket of whatever he was wearing. Then he said, "You seem to be settling in well." I remember registering that and then immediately filing it. The filing was very smooth. The reasoning was, he shares the building, he hears me moving around, the lights are on at normal hours, I'm not playing music at midnight or running the water at 3 a.m. Quiet tenant. Settling in. Normal observation for someone who lives directly below. And then he said goodnight and went back downstairs. That was the whole conversation. 4 minutes maybe. Nothing happened. Except I had filed something. That's what I kept doing. Filing things. I had a very organized mental filing system for reasons not to worry. It was a good system. The problem was what I was filing. A few days later, day 11, I know it was 11 because I remember checking the date for something work-related. I woke up and came into the kitchen, and the glass I'd left on the counter the night before had moved. I had filled it before bed. Left it on the right side of the counter, close to the sink, the way I always did. It was now on the left side, 2 inches further from the sink, 2 inches closer to the stove. Not knocked over, not empty, just not where I'd left it. I stood there for a moment. I picked it up and drank it. I thought, I must have moved it and forgotten. That's the thing about unconscious habits. They don't report to the part of your brain that keeps records. I moved it, and I didn't remember moving it. Simple. Fine. Filed. The days passed. The building made its sounds. The heat came on around 11 every night, and made that low metallic resonance through the walls. I started timing it, the way you do with things you can't control, and it became familiar, became part of the texture of the apartment. The ductwork was old and porous, and I could hear, if I stood still in the hallway, the faint rhythm of Martin's television from below. Not words, just the cadence of voices and the color of it. Different shows have different sound profiles, I learned. He watched the news at 7 and something quieter in the evenings. I thought once, I can hear him. I did not think, he can hear me. I don't know why I didn't think that. I have turned it over many times since, trying to understand the gap, and the closest I can get is that I understood the sound as information flowing from him to me, as a feature of the building I was receiving, rather than a channel that ran in both directions. The building was porous in the way old buildings are. I registered it as a condition, not as a relationship. I moved my calls to the bedroom around week 3, mostly because I was having a long video call with Devora, and I'd started to feel vaguely exposed standing in the living room. Nothing had happened. It was just a feeling, mild and vague, that the windows were too present or the room was too open. I moved to the bedroom. I closed the door. I felt better for about 2 days. Then I realized I didn't actually feel better. I'd just moved. Day 22. Martin stopped me in the entryway on a Thursday morning. He said a neighbor down the street sometimes had car trouble, and occasionally the car ended up blocking our driveway, and if that ever happened, I should let him know and he'd deal with it. I thanked him. I said I didn't have a car, actually. He said, right, of course. And then, how's work going? You've seemed a bit preoccupied lately. I stood there in the entryway with my bag over my shoulder and my coffee from the kitchen, and I tried to find the source of that. Where would he? How would he? Old building. Sound carries. I'd been on some stressful work calls. I'd been moving around late at night when I couldn't sleep. The floor between units was maybe not as thick as it looked. He could hear, the way I could hear him. Patterns, rhythms, the texture of whether someone was okay or not. And I'd told Devora about work being busy just last week, on the phone, and sound carries through the ductwork, and if he heard that call through the floor, it would explain. The explanation was plausible. I believed it for about half of the walk to the coffee shop, and then I arrived and sat down and opened my laptop and did not fully believe it anymore. And then I opened a work file and started checking distribution anomalies for a routing data set, and the not quite believing settled into the back of my mind where things go when you're not ready to look at them directly. There was a detail I kept not landing on. I didn't have a car. I'd said this to exactly 2 people in conversation, my sister and Devora. I had not said it to Martin, not on the walkthrough, not in any exchange I could recall. He would have no reason to know it. But of course, he might just have assumed. A woman my age, urban, no parking spot requested. A reasonable assumption. I wrote this down. Actually wrote it down in a notes document on my laptop, the one I used for work, because it felt more serious there than in a personal document for some reason. I wrote, doesn't know about the car, reasonable assumption, but how does he know about work being stressful? I stared at it. I wrote, sound carries both ways. He hears the rhythm, that's all. I saved the document. I closed the document. I went back to my routing data. That was day 22. My sister called on the 25th to check in. We talked for an hour. She was dealing with something at work, something with a colleague who kept taking credit in meetings, and I listened to the whole situation and gave her my read on it, and we talked about our grandmother's birthday in January and whether I'd come back for it. I said I would. I said the apartment was fine, the job was fine, the city was still feeling a little unfamiliar, but that was expected. I mentioned that the building was old and loud and that the landlord was a little, and then I said, I don't know, he's attentive. She said that sounds nice actually, a landlord who pays attention. Yeah, I said, I guess it does. After the call, I sat in the bedroom for a while. I thought about the document on my laptop. I thought about the explanation I'd built. Sound travels, old ductwork, thin floors, and the way it almost held and almost didn't. My job is finding the thing that doesn't fit the expected distribution. My job is asking large sets of data points whether they have a secret. And there was a small data set here, 4, maybe 5 data points, each explainable on its own. And the question I kept not asking was whether they had a secret. I opened the notes document. I added, the car. He knows about work stress. He knew I was settling in on day 8. What is the data point density for a man who simply lives below you and hears noise through the floor? I stared at that sentence for a while. The density was wrong. It was higher than it should be. Not dramatically, not in a way I could point to and say, here, but the distribution was off. Each point had an explanation. The set had a shape. Then I closed the document again because I'd been staring at it for 20 minutes, and I was supposed to be finishing a report by end of day, and the alternative to being a data analyst about my own landlord was to do my actual job. 3 days later was day 28, and I left a glass of water on the counter again. I know I shouldn't have. I'd told myself I wouldn't, but it was late, and I was tired, and I filled the glass and set it by the sink, back on the right side, close to the edge the way I always did, and I went to bed. In the morning it was on the left side again, not knocked over, not empty. 2 inches closer to the stove. I stood at the kitchen counter for a long time. This time I did not drink the water. Okay, stop. Think. The floor was slightly uneven. I'd noticed this in week 1, the way standing water pooled slightly toward the center of the bathroom. The kitchen floor might have the same grade toward the left side, which would mean a glass set on a slick surface might drift over time. That was a physical explanation. That was testable. I got a level from the hall closet, the small one I'd bought for hanging pictures I hadn't hung yet, and I put it on the kitchen counter. The bubble floated slightly right. The counter graded toward the right side, not the left. Moving the glass to the left, toward the stove, would be moving it uphill. The glass had moved uphill, on its own. I put the level back. I poured the water out. I put the glass in the cabinet. I am a person who works with data. I am not a person who believes things move on their own on a slight uphill grade. I understood that the list of explanations was getting shorter, and I did not let myself look directly at what that meant. I tried once more, tried to say it out loud. I called Devora that night, caught her between things, said I had something maybe weird to talk about. She said go ahead. And I started. The landlord seems to know things about my schedule, things about work, things I didn't tell him. And she said that sounds uncomfortable. Do I think he's just being nosy? And I said, well, he lives below and the building is old and sound carries, so it could just be. And I heard myself. I heard exactly how it sounded. Not the accumulation, not the timing, not the grade of the floor or the glass that moved uphill. Just, my landlord asked how work was going. That was the sentence I was actually describing. That was what I had. Never mind, I said. I'm just tired. New city stuff. She said, okay. We talked about something else. She told a story about a terrible date and it was funny and I laughed and the conversation ended well and I hung up and sat very still on the edge of the bed. This is Martin's primary protection, I thought. The gap between how it feels and how it sounds. I can feel the shape of something I cannot prove. And that gap, that specific, precise gap, is exactly what protects him. From me, from anyone I might tell, from any conversation I might try to have. He exists in that gap. He has been existing there very comfortably. I did not sleep well. Day 31. I came home late, after 9, which I didn't do often. I'd had a long work call that ran over and then I'd gone to the grocery store after, later than I usually would, and I was tired and carrying 2 bags, and I unlocked the front door and came upstairs and unlocked my door and put the bags down and turned on the kitchen light. The note was on the counter. Hope the call with your mom went okay. Martin's handwriting, torn from something larger, centered on the counter, not placed hurriedly, not slipped under the door. On the counter, in my kitchen, which I had locked when I left. My mother has been dead for 3 years. I don't talk about it. I talk about her, sometimes, but I don't lead with her death. I don't mention it to new people. I haven't mentioned it to anyone in this city. I have not mentioned it to Martin. I had not mentioned it on any phone call I could recall making in this apartment in the past month. Except I had. I had mentioned it. Not to Martin, to my sister, 5, maybe 6 days ago. She'd called on a Wednesday evening, and we'd talked about January and the trip back, and she'd said something about the holiday, and I'd said I still found it hard sometimes. The holidays. Since Mom. I said, since Mom. We'd talked around it the way we always did. Careful in the way you get careful around a shape that doesn't change. I'd taken that call in the kitchen. Standing at the counter, glass of water nearby, phone to my ear. In the kitchen. I put the note down on the counter very carefully. I looked at it. I looked at my kitchen. I thought about Martin in the apartment below, and the ductwork that ran between us, and the porous old building that carried sound both ways, and the way I'd noticed I could hear his television and had genuinely not, considered the inversion of that. He heard me. He heard me say, since Mom. He heard enough to understand that my mother was gone, and he had written it down in his little brown notebook most likely, and he had waited for an opportunity, and he had written me a note about a phone call he was not supposed to know happened. He had a key to the apartment. Landlords have keys. He had been in my kitchen. I stood there for a long time. The forced air heat came on and made its metallic sound through the walls, and I didn't move. I thought about my mother. Not about the note. About her. What she would have sounded like on the phone with me. Whether she would have worried about me in this apartment or told me I was being dramatic, or both at once, the way she used to do both at once. I thought about the particular thing it costs to talk about someone who is gone. How you don't do it casually. You choose when you do it and with whom. And I had chosen my sister in my own kitchen, and someone else had been there. Then I thought about the note, the specific intention behind it. He had heard something private and he had used it. Not to threaten. To, what? To show me he was paying attention? To offer comfort he had no business offering. To make a small human connection through a medium that required him to violate everything that stands between people? I want to tell you I went to sleep. I didn't go to sleep. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet for a while. I thought about the calculation. $1,800, $412 in savings, the math that didn't work, the bridge I'd burned going back. I thought about everyone who had watched me leave. Then I stopped thinking about the money and the bridge, because those thoughts were something I could pick up tomorrow. And what I had right now was a very specific problem that needed a specific solution. He'd heard the call through the ductwork, I thought. That was one explanation. Thin floors, porous building, old ducts. I'd heard his television. He'd heard my conversations. That was the explanation I'd been living in for a month. But the data point density was wrong. It was too high for ambient sound through old floors. It was too specific. He knew about work stress. He knew about the car. He knew about my mother and the timing of a specific call. This was not a man who occasionally caught the rhythm of someone's life through a shared wall. This was a man who was receiving information clearly enough to act on it. Sound through the ductwork, possible. Consistent with the architecture, consistent with what I'd already established. Something else? Also possible. More consistent with the data. By morning, I had a theory I couldn't prove yet, and I was going to prove it anyway. My job is finding the thing that doesn't fit the expected distribution. I'd been doing this work for 5 years. I knew exactly how to approach a dataset that was suggesting a hidden variable. You don't go looking randomly. You go to the most statistically probable location first. I opened my laptop, not on my home Wi-Fi. I picked up my bag and walked to the coffee shop. It was early, before 8, still smelling like the bakery next door, and I sat at my corner table and opened a new browser window and started searching. Not for Martin, not yet. For the thing I thought he might have used. Audio monitoring devices, the kind that don't require an internet connection, battery-powered, small enough to fit behind an electrical outlet cover. I found them quickly because they are not difficult to find. They are sold legally. They are sold for purposes like monitoring elderly parents, checking in on housekeepers, keeping an ear on a space when you're not present. They are available on 4 different retail sites, and the reviews include things like discreet and easy installation and great battery life. I sat with that for a moment. The normalcy of it. The way something like this just exists on a retail page with a product photo and a star rating. Then I looked up the most probable installation location, behind an outlet cover near the entrance to the main living space, close to where a person would stand when they came in, spoke on the phone, lived their life in the front rooms of their apartment. Standard placement, according to 3 different sites I found, which was a sentence I read and put down and picked up again. Standard placement. I finished my coffee. I walked back to the apartment. The outlet nearest the front door was on the wall to the right as you came in, about 4 feet up. I'd plugged the lamp into it in week 1 and not thought about it since. The lamp was still there. I unplugged the lamp and set it aside and looked at the outlet cover. Cream-colored plastic, slightly off shade from the walls, 4 screws, 2 visible, 2 at the bottom. I got a screwdriver from the hall closet. I photographed the outlet before I touched anything. Then I put the screwdriver to the first screw and turned it. The cover came away from the wall. Behind it, nestled alongside the wiring, held in place with a small piece of putty, was a rectangular device about the size of a matchbook. Dark gray. 1 small indicator light that was not on. 1 small opening that was clearly a microphone pickup. I held the screwdriver in one hand and the outlet cover in the other, and I looked at the device for what was probably 10 seconds and felt like longer. It was lighter than I expected. That was the first thing I thought. Not a profound thought, just, this is very light for something this heavy. I photographed it without touching it. I photographed the outlet cavity it came from. I got a measuring tape and photographed the device next to the measuring tape so the size was on record. Then I put the outlet cover back without removing the device. I did not remove it yet. I put the lamp back. I plugged it back in. Then I stood in my hallway for a moment. He had installed this. He had come into my apartment before I moved in, or after. I didn't know when. He had a key. And he had put this behind my outlet cover, and he had been listening to everything. Every call. Every conversation with my sister, with Devora, with Priya. Every time I talked to myself when I was working out a problem, the way I do when I think no one's listening. Every time I cried, which I had done twice in this apartment. Once in week 2, when the exhaustion of the move landed, and once later, when something at work went sideways, and I was already running on empty, and it tipped into just sitting on the bathroom floor for a while. Both of those times I had been alone. Both of those times I had believed I was alone. He was there for both of them. I went to the basement that evening. Not for any purposeful reason. My laundry had been sitting in the dryer for 2 days and I needed to deal with it. The laundry room was in the basement off the back stairs. 1 washer, 1 dryer, a wooden bench along one wall, a single bare bulb overhead, and a small frosted window near the ceiling that looked out onto the side yard. I transferred the laundry into the basket. The dryer was still slightly warm. I sat down on the bench to fold things because I could never bring myself to haul a full basket upstairs to fold it on the bed like a normal person. The window showed the side yard going dim. That particular gray-blue of an evening in November. The color of the sky when the last of the light is leaving, but it hasn't fully left yet. I folded a shirt. I folded another shirt. And then I just stopped. It landed, not as a thought, but as a weight. What he'd done to my schedule. I could categorize that. An invasion of privacy, a violation of the lease, probably illegal, definitely actionable. I could hold that in the part of my brain that does categorization, and it would sit there, properly labeled. What he'd done to my sense of privacy. I could hold that too, as a category. Anger, the kind that comes with violation, the kind that has clean edges. But the other thing, the thing I kept moving around without landing on. He had been there the night I cried for 40 minutes on the phone with Devora, in week 2, still in that strange, numb aftermath of the move, when everything is simultaneously too much to process and too exhausting to feel. I had been sitting on the kitchen floor, right there, 12 feet above where he was sitting. And I'd told her I wasn't sure I'd made the right call, leaving. And she'd said, "Of course you did." And I'd said, I didn't know. And I'd cried in the way you cry when you've been holding it and can't hold it anymore. She'd stayed on the phone. It had taken 40 minutes to stop. He heard that. He heard the morning. Day 19 it must have been, when I came back from the coffee shop having had a very bad call with my manager about a dataset I'd misclassified. And I stood in my own kitchen and said out loud to nobody, "I don't know if I'm going to be okay." Just that, to an empty room. The kind of thing you say when you've stopped managing the feeling and it comes out before you can catch it. The specific, private thing you say when you are alone. He was there for that. He had heard the private version, the version I give to no one. Not to my sister, not to Devora, not to Priya. The version that exists only in rooms you believe are empty. He had been inside my worst moments without invitation, without my knowledge, and he had listened, and he had kept listening, and he had stayed down there in his apartment, and he had heard me be small and frightened in my own kitchen, and he had probably, I didn't finish the thought. I couldn't. I sat on the bench in the laundry room with the half-folded shirt in my lap and the frosted window going dark, and I didn't move for a long time. The bare bowl buzzed slightly. There was the sound of the dryer cooling, that particular metallic click it made every 30 seconds or so while it contracted. Nothing happened. Nothing needed to. I just sat with it. The full shape of it. Not the legal category or the actionable violation. The thing he had taken that didn't have a clean name. The moments I had given only to people who had earned them, over years, in exchange for their own vulnerability. The specific intimacy of the worst versions of yourself, offered voluntarily as an act of trust. He had those now. He'd taken them. I had not given them to him, he had just taken them. Eventually, I picked up the shirt and folded it. I folded the rest of the laundry. I carried it upstairs. I put things away. I did not sleep well that night either. But I slept, and in the morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what I was going to do. The thing I could not do, confront him directly. I had no idea how he would respond to that, whether he would deny it, whether he would try to take the device before I could document it, whether the situation would become something I couldn't manage. I was living directly above him. He had a key. Until I understood what he would do with information, I could not give him any. The thing I also could not do, call the police that night, or that week. I had one photograph of a device I had not yet removed from the wall. I did not know if it was illegal in my state to possess one. I would find that out, but I didn't know yet. I needed to know what I actually had and what it actually meant before I handed it to anyone with authority over the situation. What I could do, research, quietly, on a network that was not my home Wi-Fi, so that whatever I searched was not visible on a router that technically belonged to the man I was researching. I went to the coffee shop. I spent 2.5 hours there. I found out, in my state, it is illegal to install an audio recording device in a residence without the occupant's knowledge or consent. It is a criminal offense. It is also grounds for immediate lease termination without penalty. I found this in the Tenants' Rights section of the State Housing Authority website, in a section about habitability and unlawful surveillance. Tenant may terminate lease without financial penalty upon documented evidence of unlawful surveillance by landlord. I read that sentence 3 times. $1,800, $412 in savings. The math I'd been doing for 6 weeks. The math had changed. I wrote down the name of a tenants' rights organization that offered free consultations. I wrote down the specific statute number for unlawful surveillance. I checked whether the type of device I'd found, battery-powered, audio only, fell under the statute. It did. I took a screenshot of the statute. I emailed it to myself from a new email account I created at the coffee shop. Then I sat there for a moment with my empty coffee cup. I was not done. Being right was not enough. I needed documentation that would hold. A photograph of a device I'd found was a start, but I needed to be more careful about the chain of what I had and how I'd obtained it. I pulled up my notes file, on the coffee shop Wi-Fi, not my home network, and I started writing down the timeline. Every interaction with Martin, every data point, the dates I remembered, the ones I'd written down in the work document, the specifics of each conversation, the glass of water and when it had moved and where, the note on the counter with its exact text, the handwriting I'd recognized from the lease. I wrote for 40 minutes. When I stopped, I had 6 pages of notes with dates and details, and it was thorough in the way only a person who cannot turn off pattern recognition could have made it. I saved it in 3 places. I sent a copy to the new email account. Then I went home. Martin knocked that evening. I heard him on the stairs and stood in my hallway for a second before the knock came, waiting. He knocked twice, the way he always did. 2 short, unhurried knocks. I opened the door. He was holding a paper, a form, building inspection scheduled for 2 weeks out, twice annual. He did these in November and April. He said it was just a heads up. He asked if Tuesday morning worked. I said Tuesday morning was fine. He asked if I'd been sleeping okay. He said he'd noticed my light on late a few nights. I said work had been busy, holiday crunch. He nodded. He said, of course. He said goodnight and turned and went back down the stairs. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway, holding a building inspection notice on a half sheet of paper, and I thought about the device on the other side of the wall, 6 feet away, and about the fact that he had just stood in my doorway and looked at me, and I had looked back at him, and he did not know what I knew, and I did not let him see it. He'd asked if I'd been sleeping okay. He'd noticed my light on late. I put the notice on the counter. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and thought about the 4 appearances between me and the exit from this situation. Not Martin's appearances, the steps. Document, remove, report, leave. 4 clean steps, which is the kind of thing your brain produces at midnight when it needs the problem to be manageable. In the morning, I was going to do the first one properly. I spent 2 days not doing anything visible. I went to the coffee shop, I did my work, I talked to my sister on Thursday, a normal call, the regular kind, and this time I took it in the bedroom out of habit, but also out of something else, some reflex that understood the kitchen was no longer simply the kitchen. I didn't tell her anything. I was not ready to tell her anything yet. I needed to finish what I was doing first. On Friday morning, I went to the coffee shop early and sent a contact form to the tenants' rights organization and got an automatic reply saying someone would call me within 48 hours. Then I went home. I stood in front of the outlet by the front door for a while. I unplugged the lamp. I got the screwdriver. I took photographs. The outlet, the surrounding wall, the lamp pulled aside, everything before I touched it. Then I removed the outlet cover. I photographed the interior again. Then I put on a pair of disposable gloves, the kind I had from cleaning, blue latex, and I carefully removed the device. It came away from the putty cleanly. I held it in my palm and photographed it from 4 angles. Top, bottom, the microphone opening, the small indicator light that was not on. I photographed it next to the measuring tape again for size. I photographed the cavity it had come from with the device absent, showing the putty residue on the inner wall of the outlet box. I put the device in a small hardware store bag, the kind that comes from picking up a single bolt or switch plate, a small paper bag I'd had in the junk drawer. I folded the top over and put it inside a zipper pouch inside my bag. Then I replaced the outlet cover and plugged the lamp back in. I took all the photographs, 15 of them, and I wrote a single sentence in a text to my sister. If anything happens, this is why. I attached all 15 photographs. I hit send. She called 40 seconds later. I answered. "What is this?" she said. I said, "The landlord installed an audio monitor behind my outlet. I found it this morning. I have the device. I have photographs. I'm removing it. I'm sending this to you as a record. I'm going to talk to a tenants' rights attorney. I'm okay. I need you not to panic right now because I need to be calm to do this correctly." A pause. Then she said, "Okay. How long do you think this has been there?" I said, I thought it had been there since before I moved in. Another pause. She said my name, just my name, the way she says it when she's scared and being careful. And then she said, "What can I do?" I said, "Keep those photographs somewhere. I'm not the only one who has them." She said she would. She said she'd back them up. She said she loved me and she was glad I was okay, and she said the second I needed to leave, I should call her, and she would figure out whatever needed figuring. I said I knew. I said I would. We stayed on the phone for another few minutes without saying much. The heat came on and made it sound through the walls. I stood in my kitchen and let the sound do what it was going to do, which was nothing, because the device in my bag was not in the wall anymore, and whatever he was receiving from this apartment was only what I was deciding to give him, which was the sound of me standing quietly in my own kitchen. I went to sleep. I slept badly, and then I slept. And in the morning, I woke up and the apartment was quiet in a way it hadn't been in a long time. I called the tenants' rights organization at 9. A woman answered. I don't remember her name. I remember she had a very calm voice and didn't seem surprised by anything I told her, which I found genuinely stabilizing. I told her the timeline. I gave her the statute number I'd found. She confirmed that what I was describing fell under it. She said I should send her the photographs. She said a formal written notice to the landlord, citing the statute and attaching one photograph, with a statement that I was aware of what had been installed and when, would serve as documentation that he had been informed. She said I had options: terminating the lease without penalty, pursuing damages, filing a criminal complaint. And she said I didn't have to decide today what I was going to do with those options. What mattered right now was making sure the record existed. I thanked her. I wrote down everything she said. I hung up. Then I wrote the letter. It took me 3 drafts and 45 minutes. I kept writing too much, trying to say what it had been like, what he had heard, what the cost of it was, and each time I had to pull it back, because that was not the document I was writing. The document I was writing was short, specific. It cited the statute. It described the device by type and approximate dimensions. It stated the date I had found it and removed it. It stated that I had documentation. It stated that I was aware of what had been installed and when, and that I was retaining copies of all records. I touched one photograph. The device in my palm, clear and centered and in focus, nothing else in the frame. I did not ask him to respond. I did not ask him to leave. I did not tell him what I was going to do next. I gave him the information and let the silence do what silence does to a person who has just been found. I printed the letter on paper from my printer. I signed it. I slid it into an envelope with his name on the front. I went downstairs. I knocked on his door. The pause before he opened it was longer than usual. 7, 8 seconds. I stood on his landing and waited. He opened the door. He was in the same flannel shirt, soft at the collar. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before. Something careful, very still. The pause that was usually in his voice relocated to his whole face. I held out the envelope. He took it. I said, "I'd appreciate it if you read that today." I went back upstairs. I locked my door. I put the kettle on. I stood at the window over the sink and looked at the narrow gangway between buildings, the gray November sky, the one tree that had lost almost all its leaves, but had 3 or 4 left that weren't going anywhere yet. The kettle took a long time, the way it does. I made the tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I did not know what he did after he read the letter. I did not check. I made no effort to hear whether he was on the phone, or moving, or still. He existed in the apartment below me, and I let him exist there. And I did not give him a single thought that cost me more than I could afford. I paid rent on the 1st of December. I paid it on the 1st of January. I paid it on the 1st of February, and March, and April, and May, and I spoke to Martin 3 times in those months. Once about the building inspection, which proceeded without incident, once about a package that had been misdelivered, and once in the entryway in April, when we were both coming in from outside at the same moment. We nodded. He held the door. I went upstairs. None of these interactions were uncomfortable in any way I would have been able to describe to someone who wasn't there. The tenant's rights attorney. I spoke to her twice more. She made sure I understood my options remained open. I did not file a criminal complaint. That was a choice. Some people will think it was the wrong one, and I understand why. I had what I needed, which was the record and the evidence and the knowledge that he knew I had them. I had the thing that Martin had been using against me from the start, the protection of being the one who possesses the information. That felt like enough. Some days it felt like more than enough. Some days it felt like nothing. In June, I found an apartment across the city. Second floor, natural light, a bathroom door with a latch that caught cleanly. The rent was $120 more per month. I signed the lease. I gave my 30 days notice in writing, citing the unlawful surveillance statute, which legally permitted me to terminate without financial penalty. I included the case file number from my correspondence with the attorney. Martin signed the notice and returned it without comment. I do not know what he did after that. I don't know if there were other tenants. I don't know if there were other devices. I decided not to find out, and then I decided that the deciding was its own thing I would have to live with, and I have been living with it. The day I moved out, I cleaned the apartment. I vacuumed, I wiped down the counters, I scrubbed the bathroom. I straightened the bathroom door frame. I'd bought a short wood plane in March for exactly this, taught myself the technique from a video online, spent a Saturday afternoon taking a thin layer off the top of the frame until the door swung clean and the latch caught the first time every time. I don't know why I fixed it. He would have fixed it himself, or the next tenant would have lived with it the way I had, but I fixed it anyway. It took me an hour, and when I was done, the door closed right and stayed closed, and I stood back and looked at it and felt something I am not going to try to name. On the last morning, I filled a glass of water and put it on the counter, just to do it. Right side of the counter, close to the sink, the way I always had. I looked at it for a moment. It didn't move. The counter graded right, toward the sink, toward where I'd put it. The apartment was quiet in a way that was just an apartment being quiet. Sun came through the kitchen window and caught the water and made a small rectangle of light on the wall. I left the glass there. I picked up my bag, I locked the apartment door for the last time, and I did not look back at the glass as I closed it. I know I left it sitting there. Full. Probably still full when Martin came up to check the unit. Still on the right side of the counter where I'd put it. Still not moved. That's the last thing I have from that kitchen. A glass of water where I left it. The exact place I left it. Not moved by an inch. Some things you don't get back. The specific version of yourself that existed in those months. The one who talked out loud in her own apartment and thought she was alone. The one who said, "I don't know if I'm going to be okay," to an empty room that wasn't empty. I don't have that anymore. Not because she's gone, exactly, because she knows now who was in the room. And knowing changes the thing you're remembering, even when the thing you're remembering was real. Which it was. It was real. I was really there. Those were really my worst moments. Really my mother's name. Really 40 minutes on the kitchen floor in week 2 crying in the specific way you cry when the weight of everything you decided finally lands on you at once. He heard that. He chose to keep listening. I decided not to look for which conversation he considered his favorite, which version of me he thought he knew. I decided that was a question I was not going to answer. Not because I couldn't find it. I might have been able to if I'd pushed, if the legal process had opened the right doors, but because the answer would not give me anything I didn't already have, and what I already had was heavy enough. There is still a version of that question I carry. Some part of me, the part that cannot turn off pattern recognition, that asks every set of data points whether it has a secret, keeps turning it over. Not often, less than it used to. I think that particular file is going to stay open for a while. I've made my peace with that.